and good day to you all, and welcome to the next podcast of the Change Dynamics subject. We're very honored today to have the presence of Shannon Wallis on our show. I'm absolutely happy that she's here. She's well known as an organization change expert, as a coach, and she has quite a interesting background when it comes to changing and effectively really changing organizations. Her idea is that change is often too slow, and she has an idea on introducing, for instance, baby steps to see if changes can be done step by step rather than just by one big leap. The other interesting thing where I think she links with the thoughts that we have presented before in the podcast is about the project sabotage. We think, and that's where I think our thoughts are linked, we think that there is a lot of opponents working in projects. We call them project saboteurs, and we're interested to see how Shannon looks upon these things and how you can deal with these opponents and with these saboteurs in order to get your change executed. We're also interested by the fact that she has reintroduced a well-known model, the model D times V times F is result. And I should explain that it's, if there is enough D, dissatisfaction, and there's enough V, vision, and you could make the first steps, then probably this result is bigger than the resistance. So you can get going if these three elements are in the right position, then you can get the change into motion, which of course is the whole idea behind change and behind this podcast on change dynamics, because we think there is a lot of change going on in the world. But despite the fact that there is a necessity for change, still companies and organizations are sometimes too slow in responding to change. It's interesting to see, and we saw that in the work of Shannon as well, that about 80% of the projects fail, which is a tremendous number. You would expect the number to be far lower. Sometimes, of course, you could expect projects to fail, but 80% means that most projects simply don't succeed. Now, this can't be just by technological reasons like techie things like a plan or a good forecast. It has to be something else. And we think something else could be soft controls, could be the way people work, because we think people are the issue. People are all about change. So a bit of an introduction, and I think we're absolutely happy, as I said, to have Shannon on our show. Welcome, Shannon. Would you like to add a few words to what I've just mentioned on your behalf?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really such a delight for me to speak to people in my field, in our shared field around organizational change, because just the fact that you even know the DVFR formula, to me is like, this is such a great start. In terms of just so you know a little more about me, I am truly a student of change and leadership. So I would tell you that my own personal experiences, which I share a bit about in the book, are a testament to life transformation. I grew up in a really humble home in South Dakota in the United States. I didn't know at that time that I was beginning my study of change, but that's where I focused my career. So I have an undergraduate degree in human development, which is really about, how do we develop as human beings? And then I complemented that with a master's degree in business. So bringing those two pieces together has really basically, formed some of my initial academic study around why do people and businesses change, and why don't they? So then I took that study into my career, first at Coopers & Lybrand, then Price Waterhouse, where this is specifically what I worked on, organizational change, later Coca-Cola, and then finally Microsoft before I went out on my own. So, my experience is both academic and as well very practical, working with individuals, teams, organizations, nonprofits, around how do we actually realize the visions that we want to create. So I share that with you because, I think in our field, there is so much information that is available on the internet these days around change. So when I did my research, I found literally billions of websites dedicated to how you can make change happen. And I think the advantage of having studied it for so long has enabled me to bring it down to the simplicity of the DVFR model by Gleicher and Beckhardt. Just because if you look at all of those models, it always boils down to, do you have dissatisfaction with the current state? Do you have a vision for the future? And when you have that gap between the vision and the dissatisfaction of the current state, do you have your first steps that will help you get momentum to overcome the inertia associated with resistance to change? So that's what I would add to your introduction.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. I think it's a nice completion. And I think you're absolutely right. There's two elements that I very much appreciate in your thought. The first is this: you have to combine theory and practice. I mean, theory without practice is pretty useless. It's academic, but it has to work. And the other thing, of course, is that if you have enough of your formula, then the first steps can be taken, and you can really do that if you focus on those change elements.
Yeah, I would point out the 80% of the change and the project that failed. I think we cannot agree more. There's only one thing we observe there. It is very depending on the type of project, because not all projects fail. There's also a range of projects where we see that 100% of the projects actually succeed. And that's quite simple. If it's a regulatory, what we observe, when in Europe they came with the euro, 100% of those projects had to succeed, because otherwise those companies wouldn't exist anymore. And the same thing what you saw with the introduction more in your area, probably the SOX regulation when that started. All those SOX regulatory projects, I think they succeeded.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah.
My question here is, we see the same thing, that those 80% of those projects fail. But what, according to you, is the main reason why those projects fail?
So I come back to, so I agree with you. I think when you are forced with regulatory compliance, the DVFR formula that is there is quite strong, because whether people are dissatisfied or not, basically the government is saying you should be dissatisfied. You have to make a change. So before I dive into that a little more, what I'll say is, for those who are being introduced to this formula for the first time, who may not have the same change background we do. So what does that formula actually mean? So it means dissatisfaction of the current state times vision of the future times steps is greater than or overcomes resist change. And specifically, it's a multiplication equation. So it is metaphorical, but if you think to any of those elements in a multiplication equation being zero, non-existent, so if you're missing dissatisfaction with the current state, and that's a zero, the product of your multiplication equation is zero. So you don't overcome resistance to change. And so you remove any one of those, and as a result, that's where you see change projects fail. So I do come back to that. Why do I think they fail? I think one of those is missing. That is specifically what I've seen, and in my research with my clients, when they think back on their projects that have succeeded, all of those elements, even if they were tiny, even if the dissatisfaction was just a little bit, but they had it, they would move forward. If one of those was missing, they wouldn't. Now, the reality is, it's interesting. As I understand it, based on my research, about 25% of our population is more vision-oriented than current state-oriented. So this is, I think, really important, because in 75% of the population then is current state-focused. So often when changes come forward, it's because somebody has a new big idea that they want to launch. So that appeals to those of us who are what I call originators, vision-oriented. That excites us, but it doesn't necessarily excite those who might be more current state-focused. That's 75% of the population. And so then as a result of that, think about that. Those people really need a compelling case to say the current state today is no longer satisfactory. But that's kind of hard. Unless you really see that your metaphorical house is burning down, it may not resonate with you. And so I find that's where you see then, not necessarily out of malice do our opposers pop up, but out of conservatism. For example, they want to be cautious. They have big organizations and teams that many families rely on. Yeah. And so that's where they start to dig in their heels a little bit to say, that's a good idea, but.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I think about it, is that it's often the human element that is getting in the way of true transformation.
Yeah, we think that what you're touching upon is a sort of resistance to change, that people are more of a passive kind of attitude towards change. And the thing is, what we've got, we know what we've got, so that's the best thing to continue, rather than see if there's something new, unless, of course, there is enough push for them to go ahead, then the change usually occurs. Now, the interesting about opposers is that requires not just a passive attitude of saying, well, I don't want this, but they actively oppose, they work against you. And that's where I think the parallel could be between the opposers and the saboteurs, because the saboteurs actively say, right, I don't like this change, and in order to hinder, to delay the change, I've got a few tricks in the book that I can play now. Mm-hmm. Is that a parallel you could see?
Absolutely. I think, as we know from change projects, one of my first steps is always to identify my stakeholders and then map them. So I'm looking for people I'm looking at my stakeholders who are first have high degrees of influence or power in the system, and whose cooperation to get the change adopted, their cooperation would be required. It's absolutely necessary. Then in that state, I look at what is their readiness for change. And when, my opposers are people who are, for whatever reason, saying, I'm not ready. I don't think it's a good idea. Some can be very active in saying, I think it's absolutely a bad idea. But, but honestly, people don't always do that directly to your face in an organization because, they're worried about their own political capital. But they'll do it in more subtle ways. They'll use chains of influence to spread seeds of discord with the population. That's a good idea, but how will we implement it globally? That's a good idea, but it seems like it'll take a lot of time, or it'll take a lot of investment. We don't have that kind of capital right now. And so as a result, yes, the opposers that I talk about in my book are people who, the ones that I'm paying closest attention to are those people who have high levels of influence and power, are absolutely necessary. So their voice matters. And so, with those opposers then, the first thing I say is that you have to get curious. So why are they opposing it? And often, they have made potentially assumptions that are incorrect. But I don't know that until I sit down and have, ideally a heart-to-heart conversation with them about what's really getting in their way. And that is one of my power questions. It's, the question of what's getting in your way of being on board. And it's interesting to see when I keep it open-ended, what comes up. And then from that standpoint, I can look at it and say, have they made some faulty assumptions? Or even better, have they shown light on places that I may not have thought of in my excitement to move to the future state? That if I don't pay attention to it, we might fail. So now, because I've asked them a genuine question, they raise that to my consciousness and I can mitigate the risk. Yep. So that, that to me is the kind of the classic approach, but not everybody thinks about it.
What we often observe is that people are, their position actually, and that's one of the things we always do, that they are threatened by the change and that their experience is being threatened by the change. And they have, because of their position, they have power to be an opposer. And they will, the smart opposer will never step into the open. They will never say, hey, I'm against it. Same thing what you say. Yeah, it's a good idea. Let's see how this works out. And then they start working with you. And somewhere halfway or even 30%, then they turn around and they give you the real opposition. So one of the things we always say, and the same thing I think you also do, is you have to validate the positions of the potential opposer up front. What would this mean for his position in the end? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. If you have those opposers, what would you do about it?
Well, first, the way I think about opposers is I want to identify them, right? That's my first option. And then from there, I want to basically prioritize them. So who are those folks who, like we've talked about, have the highest degree of power and influence? And power can be different. That could be, come from your title, right? But influence, look for those people who have influence in the system who may not have the title, but are also necessary to make the change happen. Those are the people that I prioritize first. When I do so, I use two different approaches. I may go to them directly. That depends on the relationship that I have with them. So I have personally learned in my career, in any change that I was trying to initiate, to look for opposers who are also, in a way, my personal supporters, but they always are bringing that voice of reason. So I know that they're going to initially say no. Those people I like to go to first and ask them, even before I launch something, tell me all the reasons it will fail. Because the rapport between us, they will tell me. And they may be interested in still helping in some way, but initially they're going to tell me it's not going to work. So I gather from them my first pieces of information around why it might fail, because then I can have that essentially in my toolkit when I go to the next opposers who may not be as friendly toward me for whatever reason. We don't have as much rapport, we haven't worked together as long, and I'll say, what I'm hearing so far is these might be some reasons that you might object to us moving forward with this idea. What else would you add to that? Now, the reason I do that is to show them that I am in the system listening, that I'm not what we call a Pollyanna. I'm not wearing rose-colored glasses. I know it won't be necessarily easy, so that they know that I'm using some common sense. That sometimes opens the door for them to reveal more of their concerns. Now, there's a third category of those who, for whatever reason, I don't have the rapport with. Then what I do is I use what are called my chains of influence. Who does have a good relationship with that opposer? I'll send them in to ask the questions that I want answered. And then they can gather more of that open-ended level of concern from those individuals. To me, what's most important is if we want this change to actually occur, we do actually genuinely want the opposer's information in order to move forward, mitigate the risk. They know things or are thinking about things that I'm not. And some of that might be accurate and some of it may not be, but at least I'm, demonstrating genuine interest. And then of course, when we go back to the opposers, we need to then acknowledge with them, this is what I heard from you. And this is what we figured out we can solve so far. And this is where we need to spend some additional time. My personal experience is if you acknowledge for people what they think is important, you are more likely to create buy-in with them. Acknowledge them, acknowledge their concerns. Don't sweep them under the rug.
Yeah. And could you elaborate on the idea of your internal opposers, what you mentioned in the beginning? If the opposer is within yourself?
Yes. So I think one of the biggest blockers we have is our inner critic. So, some of us call this the imposter syndrome. Mm-hmm. I call it, I think that's one version of it. The inner critic to me is the voice in your head that says, I'm not capable. I don't have capacity. I've never done anything quite like this before. I don't know. I don't have all of the right resources. All of those things that we tell ourselves as human beings about why we might not be good enough, might not be ready enough. And that can be such an immense blocker to moving forward, because if you're the person who has the change, you are often fighting your inner critic every day to move forward. I mean, I can't tell you how many change projects I've launched where initially I thought, are we ever going to figure this out? But you can't communicate it if you're leading or guiding the change. One of the things I will share, though, is that once I really recognized that in myself, that's when I started, I think, codifying my approach. And I mentioned in the book that I indicate that there's a place in every change project, and maybe more than once, depending on the length of the change project, where you feel so stuck that what often happens is projects stop right there. We cannot overcome this. And I did study it, and I found out if you sit with a group of people, like in the misery of it for about 4 hours on average, that an idea will come to you, but you have to sit with it. And so what I've learned is, so that's a part of my, that's when my inner critic is just, yelling in my head. You don't know what to do. We're not going to figure this out. They're all going to find out that you don't know what you're doing. And what I've learned is to have patience with that, to stick with it, because a solution will come if you sit in dialogue with it and go back and explore what you may have missed and look at it from a different lens.
Yeah, at the same time, I could imagine that Microsoft or Coca-Cola might not have the time to sit with it and wait before the change occurs. They want change almost immediately. So how do you deal with that? There is let's say, business-wise pressure to execute.
So that's where I think, as a change agent, you really are responsible for holding that space or container for the change project. I mean, I have one specific moment that I think back on frequently at Microsoft. When I joined Microsoft, essentially the company had 32 different leadership programs globally. They were all the pet projects of different leaders around the globe. They didn't have consistency. They didn't have the same competency models. They didn't have the same approach. They didn't have the same way of assessing what a leader was. And when I recognized that, having come from a much more mature organization like Coca-Cola, where all of that was really buttoned up, I was perplexed. And after working there for about a year and working within my space at that time called Sales, Marketing, and Services Group, which was about half the company, I started asking questions. Why do we have so many leadership programs? And that's eventually how I was asked to create one for the company. And in the process of creating one, we first started in the Sales, Marketing, and Services Group, and that was 19 of the programs, and then 13 of the others were in the engineering side. Once we had success in the Sales, Marketing, and Services Group, that's when the engineering side came on board and said, I think we need to create one global leadership program. And I remember sitting in a meeting where we had a one-day meeting. We were, I had to step out. I was actually interviewing a senior leader for kind of an internal podcast that we did. And I stepped out for 1 hour, leaving it in the hands of another person. We had about 20 people in the room who were working on parts of the project. And within that 1 hour, I came back and they had hit that spot. And the person who was leading it at that time didn't have my same knowledge, didn't come from an organizational change background, wasn't expecting it, and was actually in a bit of a panic, high level of anxiety. The project's imploding, we're not going to be able to move forward. And I just walked into the room and looked at everybody in this moment of anxiety. And here was the key that helped me in that moment. And this is why I say you have to hold the space. I reminded them, I said, you know what? We're about midway through the project. Do you remember at the beginning, I told you we would have a moment where we will think we cannot go forward. And that is where we are at. And then you just saw this light bulb go on in people's eyes where they said, oh, yeah. I said, do you remember? That was about 6 months ago. And I kind of kind of told them the story of when I had said that. And I said, I promised you this would happen. And just by simply kind of foreshadowing that 6 months before, letting them know we will have this moment, then they thought I actually knew what I was doing. Like, oh, she anticipated this. She warned us about it. So I said, okay. And what I didn't know then, but now I know, is that they were because I've studied neuroscience since then. But what I didn't know at that time, 10 years ago, is that they were in a classic amygdala hijack. And what happens when we are so triggered and anxious? We lose our perception, we lose access to cognition, we lose our creativity, and we lose our ability to collaborate. So in that moment of panic, of course they're saying we can't move forward because they're not thinking straight, literally. And so I said, hey, let's everybody take a break for 30 minutes. We're going to come back, regroup, and we'll move forward. And because we had that container, and because I had foreshadowed what might happen, and then because I gave them that 30-minute break so that they could calm down, they also then, when they came back, were more relaxed, and they had access to cognition, perception, creativity, and the ability to collaborate. And it took us about 2 hours, and we came up with an idea, and we were able to move forward.
Most of the time, developing new ideas in groups, if you do it the right way, it doesn't take that much time. Okay, let's have now the link to the book, because I read your book. I liked it, by the way.
Thank you.
And nice thing you did in the book, and that's what really appeals to me, at least, and I think also appeals to most readers, is that you link the theory to a real life experience. So what I see there is, and that you show that the practices, and it's actually also what you're doing now in the interview, that the practices you apply in your work, in your professional business consulting work, that those practices also can be used to turn the people's chances in life. And that's the nice thing of the book, I think.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. One quote. Yeah. I wrote down one quote there. It's a really yes, I can book. How did you come to the conclusion that this book is needed? Because you wrote it. I didn't see a book like it.
Well, thank you. So I say thank you because I'm glad there isn't a book like it. But I also think there isn't a book like it because we all have a story to tell. All of us have our own story. All of us, whether we realize it or not, are change masters because we're continually evolving our lives as human beings. None of us are still toddlers, right? We keep growing. And so, this is my story, so it makes it unique. Where it really originated was, and I've had moments in the past. So here's my book. It's called We the Change, Launching Big Ideas and Creating New Realities. I'm very proud of it. It could really be for anybody, but I wrote it, the target audience was really women. And the reason I wrote it for women was because I had a moment in a workshop 4 years ago now, where I was in a rapid coaching exercise. Yep. And somebody asked me, what's one thing that you want to create? And it burst out of my lips. I want to write a book. And they said, about what? I said, it's about change. It's about how you change things in your life and in your community. And they said, oh, who's it for? I said, it's for my daughters. Okay. And my daughters are now 15 and 17. And I knew I wasn't writing it for them in their teen years. I was writing it for them in their mid-20s. But as I started writing the book, I also realized I was writing it for my mother. So I mentioned that I grew up in a humble home in South Dakota. In the United States, I grew up under what is, we think of as the poverty line. I want to be clear. I think I grew up quite privileged by virtue of being born in the United States. Mm-hmm. I had access to education, healthcare, food, housing, and I have traveled the world. I have worked on 6 continents. I have seen real poverty. where people do not have access to those things. So by contrast, I've grown up quite privileged. But when you're a child growing up and you've never had those experiences yet, the sense of what others might have is quite poignant. And when my family lost most everything was when my father left our family and my mom was a single parent who didn't have a college education. And that happened when I was a middle school girl. And so when we think of middle school girls, I mean, that's quite a sensitive time. So I think that's why it hit me so hard. And prior to my having this idea, about 6 months prior to that, my mother had suffered a major stroke. And when she suffered the stroke, she had been a working artist. She lost complete access essentially to the right side of her body. She was right-handed, and she could no longer speak as well. As she has apraxia and aphasia, so she's still alive, but she was quite impacted and was, when I found her, she had been working on an art project. So I found her after she had collapsed. And of course, she was never able to complete that art project. And I think that was kind of an underlying part in my subconscious that was saying, what if something happened to me and I never was able to pass on to my daughters what I have learned about personal and professional transformations? And I would regret that. So that's how it started. It was really written for my daughters. And I thought, if only my daughters read it, then I'm okay with that.
Yeah, but probably the number of readers has gone up slightly now.
It has, and I'm grateful for that.
How far are you so far with the number of books being sold now?
You know, that I'm not sure as of today. So it came out March 31st. It has hit international bestseller status. So that was exciting. And, you know, as we know in the field of books, you know, it kind of ebbs and flows. So, you know, getting the message out there is really important. For me, what's really important about the book that not everybody may know is that, as I shared, I realized I wrote it for my mom. And I wrote it for women like my mom who had an idea, but are so overwhelmed and did not have the support network, couldn't afford to go out and get a coach like me to help make it become a reality. So the book has two parts. And you mentioned this earlier, you know, that we can have an idea, but then how do you actually theory versus practice? So the story is inspiration. So about the first third of the book is inspiration. It's telling a story of how did I walk El Camino de Santiago, a 500-mile, 800-kilometer medieval footpath when I was not an athlete and had never been a hiker. How did I do that? I use that as a metaphor for realizing our goals. And I've done that now, not just once, but twice. But the first time was petrifying for me. And then I take that experience and I share more than 40 coaching exercises that are self-guided coaching exercises that I use with my clients, both individuals and teams, to make change happen. And so that was the part of the book that was really important to me, that you don't just get a nice feel-good story about how one person changed something. You actually get the tools to make it practical. And here's what's important to me. So I do two things. The fourth Wednesday of every month, I sell the book on Kindle for 99 cents. So anybody basically could afford to get it. The second thing that I do is I have the workbook for free on my website. So anybody can go in and go to my website, wethechange.solutions, and download the workbook for free. Because to me, inspiration is nothing if you can't put it into practice. So inspiration into implementation, that's what's important to me.
Yeah, well, great. Nice to hear this from you, Shannon. I think we're running out of time now, which is a pity on one side. On the other side, I think your message has been very condensed. I think we had a very nice discussion in terms of professional attitude towards change, and we very much appreciate your efforts in promoting the book, not just for commercial purposes, but also for the higher good and the higher end, to inspire people and to help people with really changing their lives and making the better choices in life. So I think we're privileged today to have you here on the podcast, and thank you very much for your time And well, I think we will probably see or hear or read you soon in the near future. So Shannon, thank you very much for being with us tonight, and we wish you all the luck with your book and your professional life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was inspirational. Thanks.